Do have a proposal from Ava to for 8 a.m. Pacific on Thursday, so I'll make sure that gets onto the doodle poll. In terms of notable information, SPDX is being reviewed for Omnibor inclusion. Is there anyone who can speak about this at this particular time? So, not hearing anything on that. There is a pull
Well,
request.
actually, what I was going to say for that, sorry, it took me a second to find my mute button.
Not a problem.
I think so. As I recall, the status of this basically is we had done some contributions to both the SPDX 2.3 standard and the SPDX 3 model repo with language for including gitoids and as like an identifier type. And basically, the thought with this was for the interest was to those contributions were made before we had the new set of languages around artifact identifiers, artifact input manifests, and artifact dependency graphs, and basically to just go back and review what we had previously submitted, and then if the language needs changing, basically to submit for updating it.
Okay, cool. So that makes sense. Do we have someone who has taken that up, or is that a pending task for
I think it's
someone
just
to?
a pending task. I don't think we have anyone who's taken it on.
Okay, cool. So let's go ahead and add that to the agenda then. Under the to do. I can get it to the application. I'm saying update language model was already submitted to the PDX. So thanks for that update.
Yep.
So I think the main thing that we have going on that we could spend our time is going to be on the Omnibor benefits draft document. But before we jump into that, is there any other discussion items that we want to promote before we jump into that particular topic?
I think so. This is maybe let me see if it was already reflected in a later item, but Ed and I, so in the last meeting, he had this incomplete first pass on comment spec PR open on the spec repo, which he basically just wanted like a final sort of grammatical pass over. I've done that. He's made some edits and I've approved it. So I think that's going to get merged. This is basically, and we've discussed this submission over several meetings. This is the new Annex C. So the method of embedding an input manifest identifier into a source code file. If you're having like you have a generator of some sort that's generating code to tie the generated file to its input manifest. That's ready to merge. Do we have an existing item for Annex C?
Yeah, I'm not.
Oh, it looks like we do. Comment insertion of
do
Omnibor IDs is the one that it's called. So basically that's, I think, done. Like I'm set to merge it.
So, okay. And it says, Andrew Brinker was to take a final pass. There were the changes that were made, fixes were added in, changes were approved.
Yep.
It doesn't, I'm guessing there was no contention on any of this stuff, so it should be safe to merge, right?
Yeah, I think because we'd gone through some prior rounds about like I know Baratheon had input on where the comment should be inserted. We'd had some discussion of, should it try to go early in the file, at the end? How do you handle when there are multiple and we're doing replacement, things like that? All of that had been resolved. There was also a question of, do you include, like, do you sort of treat things as an array at all times, with having the brackets for your list, even if there's only one item? The conclusion was yes. We'd had some discussion on line length because these inserted lines end up being quite long. And our conclusion was the hashes themselves, or rather the full Gitoids with like the Gitoid prefix and the hash, are over 80 characters anyway, in many cases. And so also these are generated files, which you tend not to care as much about for formatting and observation of the code. So we decided not to worry about line length. Yeah, so I think we've sort of I think it's been discussed pretty thoroughly, and I think we've resolved all the open issues.
Okay, so I'm just going to merge it now, and
Awesome.
we will. Mark is merged in our meeting notes.
This is nice. This means we're down to having just one open pull request on the spec right now.
Woohoo! Cool. So I think because we're missing both Ed and Ava, some of the other things with regards to whether to embed or not embed, it's a bit hard to have a discussion without them.
Yeah.
So I'll make sure to get that doodle pull out quickly so that we don't slow down our momentum. Do we want to talk about anything else within the spec before we move on to the benefits document? You're more in tune with what's going on with the current spec modifications I am right now. So that's on that.
Right. Yeah, so I think, I mean, the only other open thing on the spec right now is the no embed mode stuff. So I think, if we're skipping that, then and there's some stuff to resolve there too. There's some conflicts and with updates that have since happened into the mainline spec. I would like to, I sort of want to go through, at some point, do a pass through the open issues and kind of, if there's stuff that's closed out, close it out. If there are things that need updates, update them, general cleanup, but I haven't done that yet. So there may be more to say about it, but nothing right now, I think.
Okay, cool. So with that, let's jump into, I apologize, I'm not able to share a screen right now, but let's jump into the working draft document of how does OmniBOR benefit folks.
Yeah, here, I will also, just for sort of expedience, put a link to it in the chat here.
By the way, I've been attempting to share the agenda. Is everybody else seeing the agenda on their screen?
Oh, it is there now. Thanks for pointing it out.
Yeah. Okay. So should I switch to sharing the kind of the use case document?
Yeah, that'd be fantastic.
Okay.
So I think right now we're still in a brainstorming mode.
Yeah, I think so.
So anything that pops up to mind that we want to throw into this, I think would be appropriate, even if it seems outlandish.
Yeah, and that could be, I mean, so and I need to sort of go back through that. I've been working on this, kind of working out of the categories of stakeholders. If folks have things to add there. I know last time we also had some discussion of relevant comparisons to other supply chain technologies or pieces of prior art that we can consider or reference. I'll also say, and this is in the comment up at the top as well, but it's totally fine from my perspective, at least, if use cases here include things that are predicated on Omnibor being widespread and stuff having been built on top of it. Because so there's sort of the difference between sort of near-term use cases of partial spread of Omnibor versus, if it's everywhere and, things built around it. So
one of the ways we could split that out as well is we could split the document up into levels of adoption. So we could say, like, today, here are things you get out of it that are a benefit, just with its current state.
Yeah.
And we could say, like, level 1 adoption would be like, work out what the milestones are. And the last one, whatever the last number is, like level 10 or something, it's like it's omnipresent everywhere. I have a lot of fun with the term omni. And so at that point, it's like, what is possible? Doesn't mean we'll get there, but we can point to certain things to say, like, these are the likeliness of the type of benefits we will see. And so I think that because part of the document, and this is all brainstorming as well, and we don't have to do this with this approach. But it's like, how do we make it relevant so that people can see like short-term, medium-term, long-term progression? And if it falters somewhere, like, do we still get something out of it that's of value?
Right. Yeah, I think that's good. I've added just at the bottom a section I'm calling thoughts on document structure, which includes that as a note.
Cool.
So I think I'd had a to-do for myself to go back and come up with use cases for open source program offices. I will say I don't work in an open source program office. I know some folks who do, but you know, have a particular perspective there that's I feel like I don't necessarily know enough to characterize what they're going to get out of it specifically. And this could be a question of reaching out to some OSPO folks to, you know, kind of get their perspective. But you know, I don't know that I'm ready to write out that one, unless if they're folks who have OSPO experience, that would be great.
I do have some, but not at the level that that someone from, let's say, Microsoft's OSPO would tend to have on this, because the organization that I helped with OSPO was starting from a very early spot versus when you have a much more mature organization. And I think we need to cover both. Like,
Right.
It's clear that part of the role of an OSPO is to control risk from a variety of different places that open source presents. And there are risks. It would be inappropriate to not say so. One of those risks is related towards licensing. Another one of those risks is related towards vulnerabilities that are brought into a given environment. And I believe that not in the first, like what's here today, but what could be here tomorrow is increased awareness of both licensing and with vulnerabilities that are being brought into such an environment. There's a third possibility as well, which is there are data loss prevention systems that look at outbound things. It may be possible to try to identify if there's any outbound things that basically maybe have a getoid of some source code that is considered to be sensitive. So maybe there's something there that could be used to help with data loss prevention. But there's existing things that are there, and I want to be a little bit hesitant without knowing what the state of those particular types of processes are, because if those processes work well enough, then there may be diminished or insignificant value there as well.
That brings up a very interesting thing, which is how does one log an Omnibor ID? How does one attach an Omnibor ID to things, an HTTP response or whatever? Because as you're thinking about data exfiltration, being able to see what the composition of a system was that at least participated in the exfiltration would be an interesting thing. So I think, at least in my mind, this kind of it broadens to how do we start not just associating an Omnibor ID with source code or a .o or an executable, but also how do we expose it in runtime for logging and for other kind of attachment to the data that would be analyzed during an event or related to an event.
I would love to see some kind of an Omnibor header that was included in a browser. It's something I've been doodling on since the start of the project. that ties into such a system that has like an inventory that when you make a request out, you can start with that ID, and it provides you with, even if you ignore configuration, just what packages what systems are you using, what services have you connected to, and then we make an entry of that to say like, hey, I'm going to log this and demonstrate that I'm connected. These systems as were a synthesis um, of a particular of a particular state. And that could have interesting, now that we bring up stuff like the data loss prevention, that actually brings up some interesting things there, because if at the endpoint, if you could ask questions like, hey, we know that this system has access to sensitive data, and we're not expecting such a call to have access to sensitive data. There may be interesting things that we could do there from a graph perspective that would allow us to quickly mitigate that. And maybe it's not even malicious. It could even just be a bug, but even just knowing that that connection exists is valuable.
Look, in every system, in every complex system, and this goes back to firewalls and firewall rules, which was a life I led for 6 years at Cisco. Somebody's always going to add, is going to open a port for somebody. And at some point, you never know who opened the port for whom and why. And you never want to close it, because at the end of the day, it might be an important system. So being able to tag flows of data through a cluster or through a series of clusters, I think is really important. And looking at how the data flows across systems, across topologies, also becomes very interesting. So associating data with Omnibor IDs as the data traverses a system, that also becomes interesting. I mean, it's a variant in the observability stuff around having, attaching a GUID to a request and seeing the fan out and fan in of kind of the sub requests. But I think there's another piece of this, getting back to the attaching to the HTTP headers. There's an IETF work group called Remote Attestation, which is kissing cousins to Omnibor, at least in my mind. Granted, my mind is kind of, tortured and weird, but looking at working with a remote attestation group to see whether Omnibor IDs could be part of an attestation for either an HTTP request or maybe even a network request might be a very, very interesting kind of, how do we insert Omnibor into the infrastructure invisibly, without really changing much, just like we're looking at doing at compile and link time.
So something to consider in that is we probably should start up some kind of a document that describes the different related groups that are out there and how we could possibly integrate with them. We have the community tracking sheets, but that I think was tied primarily to compilers and build tools. So perhaps we should extend that sheet or create another one that is tied specifically to these type of like IETF and other similar types of working groups. Like
it's almost like one of them is the kind of producers side. It's the compilers and other things. They're going to stick Omnibor IDs into stuff and produce the manifests, and then the other side is the consumers. It's who's actually going to get value out of those IDs being present, and how are they going to use them.
Yeah, I think it's a good way to put it.
I'll actually disagree with that, or maybe add a third class, which is the transports. Because the Omnibor IDs become a really, really great, 250 or 64 byte way of indicating some level of provenance. Being able to carry that through transport layers becomes, I think, becomes interesting, or at least logging it as the transport layers are traversed. Does, Andrew, does that sit well with you, or are you still thinking producer and consumer?
No, I think it is interesting. I think, I mean, you could have a framing of arguing that the transports are themselves consumers that, can make use of the data, but all models are wrong. Some models are useful. It doesn't matter to me so much if the taxonomy is exactly right.
I don't know. We've been arguing a lot about taxonomies and words lately, so
Yeah,
I want to make sure that we either understand the disagreement in respective taxonomies or come to an agreement about the respective taxonomies.
yeah.
Anyway, let's move on. Sorry, I'm good at distracting. I'll stop.
Yeah, there's also the fourth one, which is the destroyer of information. So we can also have something that drops it. No, I jest. I think part of it is as we progress forward here as well. I also wonder about the kind of statements that can be made for both in-band and out-of-band transports of Omnibor information. And what modes we can use to protect both environments, or both in-band and out-of-band. Like if I include Omnibor information in an SBOM, then that would be in-band, but it may be signed, cryptographically signed, using a key that is out-of-band of the SBOM. While there may be other cases like where information is transmitted out of band, and Omnibor itself is cryptographically resistant to certain types of tampering, but you still need something at the top to protect that top layer. But even if you didn't have that, it doesn't mean that that all value is eliminated. It may be reduced value, but because you can still modify the one at the top, but the complexity of performing such an attack will have increased as well. And so there may be interesting ways to think about some of these as well. Maybe not good for a use case document though, now that I'm thinking of it.
No, I think it is useful because there, at the first level, it gets back to the conversation Robert and I were having earlier today, which is, weather versus accounting. So if they're missing pieces of information, are the remaining pieces of information still useful in creating a risk model? So if we think about the risk model as an a priori thing, some data is always better than no data. The second piece of that is, one of my fantasies since Ava and Ed started talking on the board to me, this goes back 2 years, is having a public index. But with a public index, you run the risk of exposing proprietary information. So some nodes in a public index necessarily have to have, for example, a zero knowledge proof that says, I can guarantee that what I'm claiming is true. You can validate it mathematically, but you can't actually see the underlying data in the claim, which also is a way of inserting cryptographically verifiable information. And if we think about a Merkle tree, that's also cryptographically verifiable information. If we can basically start saying there is some information that's public and indexable and traversable, and some information that's proprietary but has has proofs, that may also be a way of addressing what you were talking about. Or am I going too far afield, Frederick?
I do think that is an interesting case. That the question that I have right now is going to be with the current spec. Do we have any elements that are zero knowledge proof capable? And that could be one of the things that we look at, because it could be that even if Omnibor itself is not, it could be the basis of an algorithm or an input to such an algorithm that can provide that.
So the zero knowledge thing, from my perspective, is you get to a particular, you have a public graph. You get to a particular node in the public graph. And, you know, a lot of the pieces of the public graph, you can then say, oh, you know, looking at the SBOM case, oh, okay, this is the node that references log4j version XYZ. And, you know, as you traverse down, you'll start seeing the individual files in log4j. You may also get to an Omnibor node that says, this node refers to proprietary code. So I'm going to give you the gitoid of, you know, the compiled artifact and a bunch of other stuff for the proprietary code. And I'm going to give you a zero knowledge proof that says the only way that we could have gotten to this gitoid is by having access to, you know, kind of the subnode or the subnodes in the graph.
So it's a
I-
proof essentially that we didn't just make up nodes that are in fact just garbage nonsense that we stuck in here.
Yes. And the very interesting thing from my perspective is, and maybe some of those nodes relate back to open source information. Can you basically have kind of this clustery area that says, in aggregate, it's proprietary, but here are some, but I'm going to give you some subgraphs that are open.
So,
And what, go ahead.
so here's a question, and don't take this as being skeptical, but being optimistic and curious from a lack of knowledge perspective. Um, is that, do you think it's possible to get to that point? Because if we could do that, that'd be absolutely amazing, and we'd be able to. There's a whole range of use cases that open up with that capability.
I know it's damn easy to get to the first step, which is I'm going to give you a node ID and I'm going to give you a zero knowledge proof on that node ID, or, you know, on that gitoid. That one, you know, it'd probably take me a week to code up an example, but that's entirely doable. The second one, which is, by the way, here are some subnodes in the graph that are then open. I'm not quite sure how to get to that.
Okay, so that makes sense. So we have a partial solution right now, but not enough to drive towards a general solution just yet. But we're optimistic that there may be a path.
Yeah. I guess the other thing is being able to take a node. So let's say I have, you know, the top of my Merkle tree or the bottom, whatever, the root node in my root node in my Merkle tree. We need an index to say, by the way, these other subnodes go up to this aggregate node. And the index becomes the interesting thing because that allows bidirectional traversal of the tree, which I think we're going to need for any real world application.
Yeah, and I have a database that has Omnibor information attached to it. And what you described here is exactly what I do. I keep information in both directions, like that way that I can traverse and from the bottom up as opposed to only from the top down. And it's absolutely necessary for a wide range of use cases. Like, let's say the next the next log4j like thing pops up, and we need to know where those particular libraries are used. And there's smaller versions that occur every day, like we had the one recently with GCC producing vulnerable output. Like knowing where that like where that ended up and the things that were impacted by it, you have to have the opposite path as well.
Yeah. And then once you have the opposite path, at least at the source level, you can start saying, can I find near neighbors? If file X is vulnerable, not only what uses file X, but what are near neighbors of file X? What are things that are shaped like it? What are things that have similar patterns? And that's where kind of we can fix open source vulnerabilities kind of at a global scale becomes interesting. Because right now it's just whack-a-mole. But if we
and the one that still eludes me is the Stack Overflow use case. So I copied something that tells me how to parse something in Python or Ruby in YAML, and I pasted it in my code. And then later on, we learned the hard way that they used parse rather than safe parse, which means that it now executes any random Python or any random Ruby that's in there.
Well, and let me, kind of yes, and that Stack Overflow is being used to train the large language models that are spitting out code. I will wager my entire set of wealth, like every dollar and asset that I have, that there are currently basically nationally funded groups that are polluting Stack Overflow and other places with weak or vulnerable code.
Oh, I got a use case, a real world example. Not quite that, but basically showing that it is possible. And so I was having a conversation with a professor about large language models and code generation, and he told me that the students were given a task to implement a red-black tree, and it has certain. For those who are not familiar, it's a self-balancing binary tree that has certain algorithms to where you mark the nodes as red or black, and you apply certain algorithms under certain conditions to keep it all balanced to it. Maybe not perfectly balanced, but pretty close. And they had a test suite that they had created over the past like 20 to 30 some years, that every time they saw a failure condition, they would add a test for it. So that way that whenever students submitted, they could just run their battery of tests against it and work out how correct the implementation was. There was a bug that they had only seen maybe 2 or 3 times in the whole history of the school. Suddenly in a class, around just under 50% of all the students had the exact same extremely rare bug. And when they started to ask the students, hey, how did you build your system? They had, many of them had admitted to using GPT as part of their system for generating the code for that particular node. So what you're describing here is, it's like, I see that as it's still an anecdote, but it's a real world proof of an example that that this works. That isn't a real attack vector.
So actually switching over to Mark and Andrew's comments, which I think are 100% on point. I wouldn't see Omnibor at the file level, stopping at the file level. So as we're currently imagining it, it's Gitoids at the file level. One of the pieces of metadata that I'd like to include is effectively a semantic representation of subgraphs within the files. We can't do this with everything, but for example, JVM bytecode is a semantic representation of most JVM languages. once you start seeing patterns of failure at the source code level, how do you take those semantic representations and turn them into kind of near neighbors, or what does this feel like, or what is the structure of this code that leads to the actual vulnerabilities?
Yeah,
So
that's
whether it's how does that sit both Mark and Andrew?
so that's a really great idea. I like it. It was immediately obvious as soon as you started explaining it. My exposure all the way back to 83, which had its own APIs for accessing its own parse tree, and the way I've seen some super programmers use YAML to decode code into their directed graph. On the other hand, OmniBOR right now wants to hook into build systems at the file assembly level. To take it to the next step will involve is decorating and modifying the actual code generator, and that's a deeper ask to ask our partner compiler and language and interpreter developers. So what I suggest is we leave the path open for it. We strongly suggest it. We start showing it as we show demos of it, like we work it into OpenJVM as a demonstration, but we don't slow down any of the rest of OmniBOR's progression, waiting for any language to implement that.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
I'll say as well, this is also just giving me, I don't remember the name of this. There was some experimental programming language where it was like every single function is essentially its own package and has like an identity that's based on like a hash, with the whole idea being that rather than open sourcing packages, you basically have a global graph of all of the functions that anyone's ever written. And so you can have maximum code reuse by just,
There have been a couple of experimental operating systems like that, and the WASM system interface stuff is starting to lean towards being like that. That's the direction I think the world's going to go as containers get smaller and smaller, and we more and more prove that programmers can't be trusted to not break out of their container. So again, we leave the path open for having Omnibor be able to sit on top of, leverage, or maybe to push the state of the art in these languages. But again, we don't. We don't weave it into our existing standards docs, so it confuses people who are just trying to understand how build pipelines work, and we don't slow down what we're doing for the sake of this really great idea.
right.
So I do think both are important as well, but here's something to consider. Let's say that we, in an ideal world, we implement both are accepted. The area that OmniBOR as it is today provides additional value on top of such a system, and talking about the integration of both of them, is when you get to code optimization, where the graph structure becomes blurred or non-existent as of that moment. So you get really amazing information coming in, but eventually you cross a threshold where some of that information still like 99% valuable, but to catch that last mile of like, hey, and then we found a bug in the optimizer, or in the code generation, then they both work in tandem with each other, in addition to the actual delivery of the information as well.
So using a little bit of Amazon terminology, I just want to make sure that we're not doing a one-way door here. So understanding the potential future use cases, as long as we don't code in a way that closes that door, I'm good. We don't need to solve the world's problems today, but we're building an infrastructure for capturing information that can lead to a lot of different interesting solutions.
I agree there. One of the ways to guarantee that we don't is if we have a close enough relationship, it's with one of with one of the language developers that they could start threading that something in, or if not, at the very least, have something in our test cases that threads, off the top of my head, is threads all the way down into a decorated YAML file of a DAG down to individual nodes in the file, just so that the test cases pass for that, and then we know we haven't broken it for other things.
Well, we could do an out of band example of some of this as well. Like once you've ran code that's in Go through the Go formatter, it has all of the information decorated when you can actually do a parse, and I've done this before to make a toy language that was a derivative of Go. But basically, when you parse, it'll give you information about the line numbers, and there's a lot of information in those objects, and that information could be outputted in such a way with the already Go formatted code and white space removed and so on, in thoughtful ways, empty lines specifically.
That is a neat idea, and would gather in the entire Go world. I'm not qualified. I'm hoping you are qualified to write something into write an Omnibor implementation or plugin or however it's structured to do that. And then my suggestion is to not make it out of band or make it a neat experiment, but again, make it part of the test case, or something that is the Omnibor community will know immediately if any of the reference implementations or most any core reference implementation breaks this particular feature. Because if it's an experiment that people run occasionally, nobody will care, and then we'll never know that it broke.
Yeah, completely agree. And I think that everything is there to test such a thing, but would not, but should be done if we do so, should be done in a way that doesn't impact any of the Omnibor. And I even want to be careful. Like, is this something we even want to call out in this document? Like, there's interesting brainstorming that's occurred here. We want to capture it. When we get to the actual thing that we're delivering to customers, I'm a little bit hesitant because I'm also worried about information overload, where we end up losing the people that we're trying to convince today as well.
That is a risk, and why I said don't try to do this such that we don't blow up the complexity of the specification for this. Is leave it in place in the core specification and expand on it in another specification about is Omnivor for call graphs, we could call it, or something like that.
We're gonna call it OmniGraph. Sorry.
Just stick with Omnibor.
There's a joke from before because they were talking about something before about Omni related or the weather thing. But anyways, I think that's a fantastic idea, and that's really good advice as well to keep it separate, so that we can go either direction. So where both sides are designed in such a way that they do not preclude the other from existing.
So can I make a suggestion or an ask? Maybe this is something, Frederick, that you and I work on the side, which is we go from the database to a couple of valid use cases for a security professional. And maybe we rope Robert into it as well. In other words, what would be useful to have for Omnibor on top of an SBOM? We do the bidirectional graph traversal stuff, etc., so that we can basically start identifying pieces, parts, and then move out from there to some of these fantasy things. And when I say fantasy, they're mostly mine, so I'm denigrating me more than anybody else in the call.
So I do have some working code. This code right now is in a private. It's publicly available, but it's not part of a foundation just yet, similar to Omnibor. And that particular code, my expectation is that we will eventually land it within the in toto project in CNCF once things settle down a little bit more. But we're taking it slowly, and because that one is it's not tied to the SBOM, it's tied to in toto, and then in toto can include an SBOM as an artifact or other things as well. And so, but that gets us a possible starting point in a place that is actively being picked up by customers, or I should say end users today. So yeah, let's have a conversation on this to see like where we can take this and where we can drive some of the Omnibor use cases there, depending on how things change. Like if we get the compiler support, here's what changes. If we get support from linkers, or we get support from HTTP runtimes, like here's what changes. And I think that we can put something that's thoughtful that builds on top of that, that we can feed into this document, and then use that as well to help generate a possible roadmap based upon where we feel that value really is, and the cost, and what is attainable given our resources. And then on the more fantastical areas, for lack of a better word, we could at a later time start to investigate some of these things, like what happens if we actually drive it down into the parse tree and collect information. Because at that point, even the parse trees itself, you create a for loop that all goes down, or while loop or similar. Often that it devolves down into or deconstructs into some kind of a loop object, or there's a limited number of loop objects, and they have the very limited set of inputs. And so at that point, it becomes a lot easier to reason about something in a way that is not that is not bound to, like, did I do C style, did I do Java style, or KNR style formatting, or so on.
Most really, really big companies now force your format on check-in. So the style argument has become kind of pointless. You pick what one you want when you check things out.
Often that's true, but we're talking about the open source space and trying to find information across that. That's, I can 100% agree with you. And Go format helped us out tremendously with that. And Rust format as well.
Mm-hmm. It's just that C is the one that hasn't settled on one.
Yeah.
You know, I would actually argue that going one level below source code, you know, kind of one of the intermediate representations. So quads for GCC, LLVM bitcode, bytecode for Java, that might be better places to do analytics.
Mm-hmm.
Because, you know, you're looking at roughly the same data that an optimizer is looking at. So it's actually parsed, or it's formatted correctly for semantic analysis.
Yeah, what a lot of places do is I wish there was to go more in the open source world, is they did more like what Ada pioneered in the mid 80s, and they have a higher level intermediate representation that is is one step beyond just the parse tree to actually the references graph. It's used to do a data flow analysis or a call flow analysis. It's pretty easy to extract from Go and for most Java compilers, not standards. So maybe you're right, and we pick the ones that are well known in the compilers we have now: the JVM layer, the quad layer. The LLVM intermediate representation will actually suck up a bunch of the world, and more so as time goes by.
Yeah, so that leaves us with kind of node land.
So Node is actually at performance. Well, Node is the one that's actually the easiest to compute your call graph on. Is the JavaScript interpreter is well decorated for it. And then at scale, more and more places are compiling to WASM, and so we don't is the WASM APIs for this kind of call graph are still in flux, but that problem will mostly be solved for us by them.
So wrapping up, because we're at time, Frederick, do you want to chat offline about causing trouble together, or should we just wait to next week's meeting? And are there any other actions?
I don't see any reason to wait. Like we can get started this sooner than later.
Okay. I'll pester you on Slack and we can go from there.
Perfect.
And I put it in the chat, but just a note for anyone who's interested in doing Rust stuff. I have sketched out some notes for a redesign of the Omnibor crate based on updates to the spec, because I sort of paused on that because there were spec things happening. So if anyone's interested in Rust things, let me know.
We should probably trickle those to the Go implementation too.
Sure.
There probably is going to be, because the Rust implementation was initially modeled off the Go one.
Yeah, and I'll say the Omnibor crate, because we'd split it out into two parts. The Gitoid part's pretty stable and very closely matches what the Go implementation does. The Omnibor crate was pretty bare bones and didn't do much of anything, and so this is more of a fresh sort of space anyway. But I agree that we should definitely make sure that the Rust and Go pieces have a relatively similar API. So yeah.
Which reminds me, I need to ping Ed about getting that transferred into the Omnibor project, but that's our later thing. Anyways, want to thank you all for your time, and most important thing is expect a doodle poll later today, and we'll see you all again at the same time next week. Take care.
All right. Thanks, everyone.